Thank you. I think we're ready to start. And before I introduce the guests and we start talking about Ukraine, I will give the floor first to Tim Judah, who has been recently just returned from Ukraine after spending 2 months covering the conflict for The Economist and the New York Review of Books. So before we start talking, I think we do need a little bit of reality check, and Tim also has some pictures that he will show us.
Thank you very much. I don't know, can you hear me all right? Can you hear me? Yeah, good, okay. Can we have the pictures start off? I should just introduce myself. Dejan has just introduced me. I'm Tim Judah. I'm the Balkans correspondent of The Economist, but I have just spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine, especially in East Ukraine, and it seemed like a good idea to introduce this panel, since we don't have any Ukrainians or Russians with us, to give some a kind of picture of what it looks like and what at least I perceive to be happening. I like this picture. As you can see, this is Slobodan Milosevic, Saint Slobodan Milosevic, at a former barricade in front of the town hall. I don't know if you can see, if you can't, just move on, in front of the barricade at a place called Kramatorsk, which was in the hands in spring of the rebels, or Russian black rebels, whatever you like to call them. You can see the flag of the Donetsk Republic there, and actually yesterday I saw somebody walking around outside the hotel with a Donetsk Republic flag t-shirt. So clearly there is some feeling of symbiosis here, or identification. But the reason I like this picture is because it does symbolize, to a certain extent, that, I mean, I don't want to be too flip about it, but Ukraine is the new Balkans. And what I mean by that is there are, to people who lived through the wars here in the 1990s, or journalists like me who lived through the wars in the 1990s, going to East Ukraine, there are a lot of similarities. There are many things which are very similar, but there are many things which are, of course, fundamentally different. And I think the first thing to point out is that there is no, in the east of Ukraine, it's very important to understand this, there is no ethnic component. This is not Bosnia. There is no ethnic component. If anything, if you could make any Balkan comparison, that you could compare people in East Ukraine to people who live in Montenegro, in the sense that everybody is, not everyone, but I mean, in general terms, we're talking about people being Orthodox, and there's a kind of continuum. And like in Montenegro, where people can kind of be one day Montenegrin, or the next day, or the next census can be Serb. It's very, very similar in East Ukraine, of an identity which is not particularly set. So I think that's kind of important to understand. But of course, as the conflict has gone on, people are being forced to choose sides. But it doesn't have that kind of quite that poisonous ethnic component. Similarities also include propaganda. Just as the media here in the 1990s turned people's heads, created hatred, exactly the same is happening in Ukraine and in Russia today. One of the interesting things that I'm finding people are asking me here, which is something which is coming from the Russian media, which is people are asking me almost kind of embarrassedly, isn't it true that these Ukrainians are Nazis? And this is just complete bullshit. This is incredible. Of course, there are neo-Nazis amongst on the Ukrainian side. But this idea that there's been a Nazi coup, etc., and that that the Ukrainians are full of kind of neo-Nazis, is as true as saying that all Serbs during the wars here were Chetniks, and all Croats were Ustashas, and all Bosniaks were jihadis, and all Albanians were jihadis. It's a similar kind of propaganda spin based on a grain of truth. So, please don't get seduced by these myths. Of course, they use some of the symbolism. These flags, which are often not explained either in the Western media because they don't know about it. These flags which come from the 1940s. They are symbols from the 1940s. And many Ukrainians don't even realize that these red and black flags are this a symbol of blood and soil, effectively. They just see them as a kind of flag of liberation. But of course, it doesn't, as I say, it doesn't mean that all Ukrainians are Nazis. This is rubbish. So please disregard these type of stories. Just as, of course, it's true, just as on the flip side, of course, don't forget that there are militias, some militias and ideologists coming from Russia who believe in this creed of new Russia or Novorossiya, who are also using this kind of Orthodox and Russian imperialist symbolism, as you see on the checkpoints here. These icon flags are very common in East Ukraine, and in a way are the kind of flip side of this kind of, you know, Ukrainians are Nazis ideology. Yes, there are a few people like that, and there are some Russians who believe in a kind of fascistic recreation of a Russian Orthodox empire. This is an interesting map. It's slightly difficult to see, but it is important. You probably can't see it very well. This is Ukraine, but this explains where we are today. These are the two provinces or oblasts of Donetsk and Lugansk. In spring, very quickly, the rebels, Russian-backed rebels, took quite a lot of territory. The Ukrainians fell back, badly organized, army kind of depleted, had never done anything for 23 years, completely disorganized. By August, they began to push into August, they began to push the rebels, squeeze the rebels back to the towns of Lugansk and Donetsk. They lost their big stronghold of Slavyansk. So here you see kind of we're getting towards the third week of August. Suddenly, here everything changes. This is, of course, when the Russians decided that, oh my God, these rebels are going to lose. We better do something. And the key is the town of Ilovaisk. It's about 40 minutes drive south of Donetsk. And in Ilovaisk, Ukrainian battalions, which is a code word for a kind of militias that they have, because they are battalions which are organized and theoretically under the Ministry of Defense or under the Ministry of Interior, but not like during the wars here, where they were organized by the Ministry of Interior or the Ministry of Defense. It's rather the opposite. These are battalions of volunteers who are supposed to be loosely coordinated. And the fact that they're not coordinated properly is one of the reasons that they haven't been doing so well. They did well when there was not much resistance. The Russians then decided, okay, it's time to step in. Ilovaisk, the last week of August, the battalions had taken half of the town of Ilovaisk, at which point the Russian military came in, one of the battalions deserted the front, the trap was shut, and the battalions began to retreat. They thought that they claimed that they thought that they had an agreement with the rebels and the Russians to evacuate. But on the 16-mile road from Ilovaisk down to a town called Nova Ekaterinivka, I and colleagues counted 68 destroyed vehicles as the convoys began to move down, chopped up by the Russians and the rebels, and couple of hundred died. I mean, a complete disaster right at the end of August. Not only a military disaster, but a humiliation, an appalling humiliation for the Ukrainians. This is kind of hard to see, but here you see a tank, was an APC which was blown up, and one of the Ukrainians literally blown out of the APC and left hanging for weeks on the high power cables. It's not surprising. This is one of the battalion cars that was destroyed during the retreat from Ilovaisk. But it's not, let's say along the road, just a complete carnage as they were crushed from both sides. Not surprising that Mr. Poroshenko, within 48 hours or 72 hours, had signed the ceasefire agreement with the Russians. He realized, and they realized at this point, yeah, they could fight the rebels, but when the Russians came in with the serious stuff, there was nothing they could do, and it was better to call a halt at this point. What's going to happen next? Well, we've got this so-called ceasefire, in which there is a ceasefire in much of the territory, but not in certain places where they're still fighting and have never stopped fighting. For example, around Donetsk airport, in that part of the city. So Donetsk is a big city, 1 million people. The strange thing is that when I left 2 weeks ago, there was a column of cars 2 miles long trying to get back into the city because, you know, if there was fighting around Belgrade airport, the rest of the city would be quite safe. So, you know, a lot of people are coming back, but the airport is a strategic location, and that's why they're still fighting. That's why there was people killed yesterday in an area not so far from there. Slightly similar to here, you've got these so-called republics. Here, I'm talking back to the 90s to Croatia, and also I'm thinking slightly of Bosnia, the Donetsk Republic, as you see, replacing the Ukrainian power in the city of Donetsk, and the symbols of this new regime coming in. Well, what next? I believe, and this is certainly what the Ukrainians believe, is that everything now depends on the battle which is being fought in Moscow. It doesn't depend on what happens in Ukraine. It depends on what happens in Moscow. In other words, there's one faction who believe, let's do Bosnia, let's create these republics, Novorossiya, these two parts, Lugansk and Donetsk, make them into this ideological kind of Republika Srpska style state of Novorossiya, and that will be enough to prevent the Ukrainians from doing anything. We can completely stop the Ukrainians moving towards to NATO, moving towards the EU, moving towards the West in general. But there is the other half, the hardliners, you could say, who believe in going all the way. We started this now, let's go all the way. So this is the map of Ukraine. And there's several points to make here. This is Lugansk and Donetsk, of which you see they hold maybe like a third or a half it. But there are the ideologists, the hardliners, go, no, we have to go all the way. Now look, this is important. Crimea is cut off. 2 roads out of Crimea, gas, electricity, water, all coming down from Ukraine. No land connection here. So it's fine. You can bring in food, you can bring in stuff up to now. We've been in a ferry, but winter, the Sea of Azov, Black Sea, is stormy, icy, unreliable. So if you want to strangle Ukraine in winter, no gas, no electricity, if they're going to freeze, 2 million people in Crimea are certainly going to freeze. So there are a lot of people who would like to create the corridor. And if you're going to create the corridor, well, why don't you go all the way, go up to Transnistria and the border of Romania? This is the map of what the ideologists of Novorossiya would like to create. But there's only one person who knows the answer. Are they going to do it or not? And that is Putin. Why haven't they done it now? Why haven't they done it already? Interesting question, but it's actually not that hard to answer. I think the Ukrainians decided to go for a ceasefire because they were going to lose. At that point they thought, okay, forget it, we're going to lose. At which point they have choices. They can either kind of try and see if they can make a compromise, or as Mr. Poroshenko's the head of his party and his aide, his advisor has been talking about on Facebook, he's been talking about the Croatian model. And the Croatian model, according to them, is we can't do this now, stop, ceasefire, build the army, and after 3 years, we'll do what the Croats did to Crimea. That's their idea. I mean, of course, Russia is not Serbia, but who knows what's going to happen in 3 or 4 years. The other problem is, this is a vast amount of territory. From here to the nearest Russian or rebel control area, here is 200 miles. You could take, I think this is rather overambitious, but they could maybe drive and do this, but it's a lot of territory, it's hostile territory, difficult to, you might be able to take it, because there are not many Ukrainian soldiers here, because they're all here, but you might be able to take it, but holding it is another question. Why don't they do it? Because they don't have enough soldiers. Oh, that's strange. Right? The Russians have got a massive army. But like any army, it's like, how many have you got ready to fight today? And the answer is, not enough. They have 25,000 here, 25,000 here, and according to the Ukrainians, well, I have no reason to disbelieve this, the Ukrainians, the intelligence people that I spoke to should know, the problem for the Russians is that today, the other soldiers who are combat ready to go, are in Chechnya and in the North Caucasus. If you start to move them over here, you're going to have problems with the jihadis going, hang on a second, they've like just left. Great, let's go. So everyone's got an interest to halt for the moment, but the Russians have got some choices to make. They took Crimea, now they don't really know how to supply it in winter. It's going to be difficult, perhaps there's going to be a deal about gas, who knows, but it is isolated, cut off, it's kind of like an island. And you've got this battle in Moscow between the factions. So I will stop there, and I will leave you with that, which is which was this huge monument at a place called Savo-Mogyla, which is basically the only hill in eastern Ukraine, which was fought over in 1943 and has been fought over again, and has now fallen back into the hands of the rebels. And it's even more important than it was in 1943, because today, from this hill to the border to Russia is 10 kilometers. So the Ukrainians wanted it to close the border, but they've lost it. And we as journalists are not supposed to take pictures of rebels with their faces, rather, so he obliged with a Shrek mask. Okay.
Thank you, Tim. You almost left us nothing to discuss because you saw the...
Now you can discuss the consequences.
Yes, absolutely. So let me introduce the other guests. Mr. Franco Frattini, one of the leading voices of Italian diplomacy, currently presiding over the Chamber of Administrative Court in Italy, and the President of the State Council of the United Nations in Italy as well. Then we have Valbona Zeneli, who is coming from the German Marshall Fund. Mr. George Marshall Center, sorry. Then Mr. Professor Žarko Puhovski, one of the leading intellectuals. He's coming from Zagreb, one of the leading intellectuals in the region, and Mr. Dimitar Bechev, who is the visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. I will start by asking a somewhat banal question after Tim's presentation. How did we get there? Who is really to blame for the current crisis? I think it is a banal question, but it is important because I'm not sure whether this crisis can be resolved without addressing it. And right now we have two very different narratives, one coming mostly from Russia and from the rebels, but also some voices from the West also say that this is really all the Western fault. There was an article very recently in Foreign Affairs magazine by John Marsheimer stating that essentially by expanding ruthlessly to the West, the European Union and NATO provoked Putin to take essentially what the author sees as self-defense measures, and the West has sponsored the coup d'etat, which overturned the legally elected president, etc., etc. I'm sure you have heard this argument before. It was this narrative was also presented by several people even during this forum in earlier panels. And of course there is another narrative coming from the West and from Kiev saying that this is a simple garden variety case of Russian aggression against the sovereign state, that Putin is trying to recreate the Soviet empire, or if not that, at least going back to the Cold War era doctrine of limited sovereignty in order to create a buffer zone and so basically these are two very distinctive narratives, and I would like all the guests to present their own opinion. So who is really to blame for this? Is it the West or is it the Russia?
May I? Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Tim for this very comprehensive introductory presentation of this burning issue. Well, I start from the end. Today's world cannot afford a new Cold War atmosphere. I'm saying so because being Italian foreign minister, I remember a happy time, 2002, where under the auspices of the Italian government, President Bush and President Putin decided to give birth to NATO-Russia Council. It seems to be another era, 100 years ago, but it was just 12 years ago. Now, it's absolutely necessary to work together to restore that pratica di mare atmosphere where cooperation between West and Russia is revitalized. Frankly speaking, I would commend the new apparently open-minded approach from Secretary General Stoltenberg in his first NATO Council of yesterday when he said we need to reconsider our strategic partnership with Russia. This is my end. But who is to be blamed? Well, for sure, according to our international principles, Russia violated territorial integrity of Ukraine. But this was, to me, not the beginning of the history. It was one of the elements of a vicious circle that had begun before. When I was foreign minister, for example, Europe decided to launch what we used to call Eastern Partnership. I was there. I remember the first approach in presenting, in showing that initiative explicitly as a counterweight to the Russian position and dominance and powerful, I would say, approach to some of the issues in today's foreign policy. This was a mistake made also by Europe. Then there were those even talking about Ukraine joining or getting closer and closer to NATO. This was really another mistake. So there was a combination of wrong approaches. Europe should have done something different in trying to present Eastern Neighborhood, Eastern Partnership as a more inclusive strategy in order to avoid, I would say, provoking a feeling of confrontation instead of a feeling of including everybody. Russia, of course, should have done something very different on addressing Crimea issue in that way instead of proposing and working on some alternative models to protect Russian minorities. We in Italy have probably the best functioning in the world model of protecting minorities, the South Tyrol model, which is a special autonomy, is not a federal model, but is a model granting rights, special autonomy, education, schools, justice in German language to the German minorities living in South Tyrol. Is a model broadly recognized as one of the possible models. There is the Croatian model, there is the federal model, but of course the wrong action was the simple invasion of Crimea saying these are Russians. This was a mistake. But frankly speaking, my idea, and then I will elaborate on why it's so necessary, maybe after the other speakers, why it's so necessary to restore a strategic cooperation with Russia, talking about some regional crisis in the world that impose to have a cooperation, but now I limit myself to say both Europe, the West, and Russia had been making some important mistakes on that at the very beginning of the crisis.
Let me start first by thanking. I'm very honored to be back at the Belgrade Security Forum, and really what you're doing for the region is really great. We have been discussing over the last 2 days regarding what happened in Ukraine, whose fault it was. I would like to take a slightly different perspective. If you look, at the situation in Ukraine, it seems like the protest began against the government for dropping the ties with European Union, so closer ties in terms of trade with European Union. But the failed EU association agreement for Ukraine, I think it was only the trigger. It was only the tipping point. I think the crisis in Ukraine stems from more than 20 years of self-inflicted problems, of weak governance, loop-sided economy, very rampant levels of corruption that had really hampered and damaged the economic and social development of the country. So even the struggles with the identity issues since the beginning of the 90s in Ukraine actually were held by the infighting among the political elite and also from the lack or the failure of the government to build up strong democratic, economic, and political institutions, which hampered the economic development of the country. It is very interesting to see when you look at the Transparency International data in terms of perception of corruption. Ukraine in 2013 ranked 144 out of 177 countries, so very close with Nigeria and other African countries. And the situation went deteriorating in the recent years. And also, according to another institution, the International Foundation of Electoral Systems, in 2013, 47% of people thought that the main challenge for their country, the main threat for their country, was corruption. It was also interesting to see that still, Transparency International Global Barometer, 36% of people were ready to take the streets to fight corruption. And this was everything before the protest even started in Ukraine. So I like to also see it from the perspective that, how is weak governance and corruption becoming a really unrecognized until now threat both to national security but also international security. So I'll say that it is undeniable now that the European order has been challenged by the Ukrainian crisis. My question, and I don't have the answer, I hope we'll find it by the end of the conference, is when did it start to be challenged? Did it happen just last year, or there was time that the pieces were already there?
Thank you. Professor Puhovski, you're coming from Zagreb. Tim did make some comparisons in his presentation of the Ukrainian situation with the forming of Republika Srpska and Republika Srpska Krajina during the 90s here. So do you see this as the aggression of Russia against Ukraine or legitimate self-defense by Putin?
I see no reason to doubt that there was aggression. I think it's obvious. But there is another problem. Tim's parallel is wrong. In Yugoslavia, the whole problem started with the coup d'etat orchestrated by Milosevic. Now the coup d'etat was orchestrated by the other side. Petro Poroshenko, in terms of Yugoslavia in the 90s, is Dobrica Ćosić, the president of Yugoslavia, left by Slovenia and Croatia, and elected by the others. I mean, if Ukrainians were really so against corruption, how come they elected the prince of corruption for the president? I mean, it's a very funny thing. And the parallel does not function. There was coup d'etat on so-called western side, while Milosevic coup d'etat was so-called eastern whatever coup d'etat. So the parallel stops here. And, of course, there was aggression of Russia. They took part of the legitimate territory of Ukraine. But somehow no one had problems in attacking some other countries in the past 20 years all around the world with other aggressions. For instance, Libya. It's really so that we live in a situation where some things cannot be done in Europe, but of course in Africa or Asia, something else. And I think that's now the problem. That it's not, unfortunately, it's not about Ukraine, as it was not about Gavrilo Princip in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's about remake of an old movie known under the title The Cold War. But the Cold War now, without one essential dimension, without ideology. And this is now geopolitical interpretation of Cold War, with very funny consequences. For instance, CNN launched information some 4 months ago. The whole world condemns Putin, which was the whole world minus Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, 3/4 of Africa, and two-thirds of Latin America. That's the whole world, because this is the world. Then, 3 weeks ago, BBC launched the information that the whole the United States are in panic because first 2 Ebola patients are entering the Western Hemisphere, because they forgot that Ebola started within the Western Hemisphere, because this part of Africa is west of Greenwich. But of course we know now that Western Hemisphere is about America and Coca-Cola and capitalism. Where there is no Coca-Cola and capitalism, there is no Western Hemisphere. This is the indication how stupid journalists always say the truth, which a bit less stupid politicians are trying not to say.
On behalf of my the quote from the CNN you mentioned was actually if I remember correctly, State Department's statement. So it was,
but
the
they
journalists were just.
What do I want to say? They make it public. They make it. I don't think the State Department wanted this to be public. Maybe it was.
No,
okay.
they said after the UN vote.
Both sides are stupid. I have no problems with this. So what we see now is a real Cold War, and no one really cares about Ukraine. This is now the case we are watching. Putin plays a very obvious offensive, aggressive political role with a very simple explanation. Why should Americans be allowed to do this as the only actor in the world? Shouldn't we play a bit with some parts of the world? And by the way, nearer to our borders than there are the parts that United States of America started. As Mr. Frattini said, it's not only about the limited sovereignty within the one side. You could have heard these days prime ministers of Slovenia and Croatia saying that they have read in the newspapers or wherever on the internet portals that Croatia and Slovenia joined the coalition against the terrorism or whatever, caliphate or however they call it. They were just not informed. The American aircrafts have been crossing the skies of Austria more than 300 times in the past 10 years without a single notification to the Austrian authorities. Because that's another problem in the new Cold War, there are no neutral positions and no non-alignment movement. So we have just one and another side without different ideologies, with sheer geopolitics. And then to finish my first intervention, I see a very simple, essential question, a kind of primitive, pre-ethical question. I would support every side, every position, which brings less people killed. That's, for my position, the minimum we have to start from. The worst thing I've heard, a really stupid politician, was, in this respect, something that was said by the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, who said 5 months ago, that what happened in Ukraine is the worst military crisis after the end of the Cold War. And in former Yugoslavia, between 1,500 times more people were killed than in Ukraine. But in former Yugoslavia, Russia was not involved, so it's not about the end of the Cold War and has nothing to do with this. The real problem is only when Russia is involved. Then 1,000 people killed or 3,000 people killed can be more important than 125,000 people killed. Not to mention people killed in Africa, Libya. That's anyhow not important. So I think now the minimal starting position should be which side guarantees less killed persons. Because if Mr. Obama can say whoever endangers the life of one American can run but he can't hide, I am absolutely sure that at least more than one Russian was killed in Ukraine these days. So why shouldn't the Russians be able to say you can run but you can't hide? That's the problem, I think.
Mr. Bechev, it's your turn. Whose fault it is?
Well, it's everybody's fault, but I mean, I agree with all the previous speakers who underscored the fact that it's the end of the story, not the beginning of the story. And in my book, the story starts with the re-election, or the election of Yanukovych. The real coup d'etat was his attempt to colonize the political system. Let's not forget there was a flawed decision by the Constitutional Court to sweep aside the parliamentary constitution that Ukraine had until 2010 and bring back the presidential regime. That was a clear indication Yanukovych was not there to share power. And he wanted to centralize authority in his own hands and to sweep aside the Constitutional Court, which, by the way, in 2004 was the force that mediated in the first Ukrainian crisis. There was a moment in time like that. And that was the turning point that set the course onwards and onwards, to the point that Yanukovych decided that he's not just one amongst many oligarchs, but he wanted to be the master of Ukraine, which upset the internal balance. Now the West's fault is the belief you can do business with such people. There was a clear understanding in 2010 and the years afterwards that whatever the flaws of a person like Yanukovych, he was certainly preferable to the ramshackle coalition that was in place before that. He could deliver DSFTA relations with the West, and it was working for a time because he maintained this kind of neo-Titoist position, doing business with both sides, and the West bought into that. I think the West also was naive. Of course, Wertheimer narrative that Russia was provoked has some explanatory power. But on the other hand, when the Obama administration came into office, the big policy initiative, let's not forget, was the reset. And the main, the core idea of the reset was to cancel NATO enlargement, which was a measure of reassurance. Obviously, you cannot fight in Georgia, you could not fight for Ukraine's sovereignty, so reset was way forward and rehashing relations with Moscow. It didn't work. On the European side, the big policy idea was to embrace much more closely Russia through more interdependence, more cooperation, more Einbindung, and that was in line with the whole modernization slogan under Medvedev. It just didn't work out that way for a variety of reasons. When Putin came to power in 2012, that was a different Putin altogether. I agree that there was a defensive motive in all that, but it is defensive not because, or maybe not only because he wanted to consolidate his sphere of power in Ukraine, he wanted to keep the near abroad together. He felt vulnerable within Russia itself, with the economy stagnating, as a consensus moving against Putin, who failed to deliver the expectations of the new middle class. I sensed at the time 2 years ago that the classical mode of statecraft is to create external crisis. He couldn't afford, after Yanukovych's departure, a Ukraine that drifts apart, because it would have sent a shockwave, a domino effect to Russia itself. I mean, the people who marched in Ukraine, in Kiev, in the Maidan, were not the Bandera people, of course, were not the fascists, not the Western Ukrainians. This was the Russian-speaking middle class of Kiev, who, if they succeeded, then, I mean, the big Russian cities would probably be next, at least in Putin's mind. And by the way, the whole Maidan was started by an Afghan blogger. It was not started by a die-hard partisan from somewhere in Ivano-Frankivsk or whatever. But anyways, the vulnerability, the feeling of Putin that he's losing the plot led him to improvise this crisis. And he's clearly winning because I don't think the West has the tools to do much about it. We're in a stalemate right now, and that would be the last point I make before you ask the next round of questions. We have the Minsk compromise, but I don't think it's working right now because I don't see Russia having the incentives to implement it, to withdraw the troops. And the West cannot sanction Russia to that extent because, let's be honest, there is an enormous divergence of opinions what to do. Anytime we escalate the sanctions, the more rifts appear. Last Tuesday, apparently, there was much more consensus, but that's the exception that proves the rule, that there are quite a few governments inside the EU not willing to make the next step. It was only recently that Viktor Orban praised Putin as an example, so let me stop here.
As Professor Puhovski said, mentioned, not all the lives are apparently equal. So there was carnage in former Yugoslavia. There are still wars going on in Africa, which hardly anybody notices. But this one, despite a relatively small number of casualties compared to some other conflicts so far, is taking all the headlines. And the reason is that we have Russia involved, as Professor pointed out. Now, NATO is, on the last summit in September in Wales, has decided to beef up its presence on the eastern borders of NATO. There were US and some NATO countries' military exercises in Ukraine. There will be more NATO presence and exercises and maneuvers in the Baltic states and also near the Russian borders. How dangerous, and of course you have Russian army in Ukraine and Russian army in the Baltic Sea. So the question is, can this thing get out of hand, maybe becoming something more than just a Cold War? Is there all this posturing and saber rattling, does this actually create a possibility for the direct confrontation between Russia and the West in the future? So let's start with you, Tim.
Well, it's as we say, like half a dozen of one and half a dozen of the other. It's like if you don't do anything, then they're not going to stop pushing. I mean, there is this Leninist dictum, apparently, that certainly the Ukrainians believe that Mr. Putin is operating on, which is if you have a bayonet and you push and you meet mush, carry on. And if you meet steel, then retreat. And I think that's probably true. So I think that, you don't do anything, then what are you going to do when separatists suddenly pop up in Russian-populated towns like Narva in Estonia? So you don't do anything, that's what's going to happen. If you do, then it's risky. So it's 50% of one and 50% of the other. It's like it's not a very pleasant dilemma.
Franco, Frattini?
Well, I will be very clear. While reassuring those member states of Europe that are afraid to be at risk vis-à-vis Russia, we should absolutely be working to avoid any kind of potential perspective of escalation of the crisis into a military confrontation for two simple reasons. First of all, very in agreement with Professor Puhovski when he said it is a Cold War without ideology. So when there is ideology, there is the mutual containment. Whereas there is no ideology, risks are higher because commercial war can be transformed into broader spectrum war and confrontation. And these would be against all the common European interest and Western interest, particularly because I cannot imagine NATO confronting with Russia while working together on withdrawal from Afghanistan, preventing the crisis in Iraq degenerating, working on stabilizing Libya and Northern Africa or Syria, or negotiating with Iran, and in meantime making the war or threatening the war with Russia. So
but
it would be...
Isn't this exactly what's going on? You have
Yes,
warships in the Black Sea and the Baltics.
But this is why, in this very moment, our today's world is in a state of complete disorder, if I would be a bit brutal. Exactly because of this.
Yeah, well, I
Can this
started
go
by,
out of hand?
yeah, I started by saying that the European order has been challenged. Actually, it was Van Rompuy that said that the world will never be the same again after the Crimea annexation. Well, I'll tend to look at, it is about Russia, but I think it's also about Europe, because Ukraine, one was at least and is still one of the aspirant members of European Union. So it's not something that's happening far away from the eyes of European Union. It's in the border of European Union. So this is why maybe this has brought much more attention. On the side of Russia, I'll say that Ukraine on the other side is very important because of its huge market, 46 million inhabitants, and 80% of the gas pipelines that go through Western Europe go through Ukraine, and also the market for gas in Ukraine itself. So the Russian economy is not competitive to this day. So Russia could not really afford having Ukraine part of a free trade agreement with European Union that will be much more competitive for Russia's products and services. So this is one point. On the other side, looking from the perspective of NATO, I think it has been a wake-up call for NATO too. It seems that the speech in 2011 of the former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, was kind of prophetical, because he really brought the issue that nations of NATO lack military spending, but also political will to be committed. And he also talked about also the reluctance of U.S. Congress to bankroll again NATO. So I think what happened in the recent month has been a wake-up call for countries within European Union, strong leading countries, but also for institutions itself like European Union and NATO.
Professor?
I think the real benefactor of this crisis is NATO. After a quarter of century, they have found a reason for existence, after all. After 1990, no one reasonable could have seen why should NATO exist. It was designed to fight communism. The communism was out of the game. And suddenly they have to start inventing enemies. Suddenly the whole world were somehow allies, including Russia, as Mr. Frattini has said. So they would be in need for little green creatures from the planet of Mars as enemies, or to combat a phenomenon called terrorism.
We had little green men in Ukraine,
Yeah.
but they didn't come from Mars.
They didn't come from Mars, yeah. But the point is, what we really needed, and it's clear for all the experts for the last 15, 20 years, is a very solid cooperation among the police forces in the world. Because the terrorism is something you fight with the police, not with the army. NATO didn't have any enemies, so they organized themselves in a kind of business of inventing enemies. And they now finally have an enemy. Suddenly no one asks the questions when an incident occurs with the Russian aircraft and Canadian ship. What is a Canadian ship doing 14,000 kilometers from Canada within the Black Sea, 80 kilometers from Russian soil? What is the answer to this? So-called world policing using 15,000 brutto tons ships. I mean, this is something we should start questioning. And this is the real problem. NATO is suddenly we have a reason to say, yes, it's good to be in NATO. But then suddenly, a right-wing, radical right-wing, internet portal in Croatia published 2 days ago an article under the title, "Serbs did it again." They were more clever than Croats. They are not going to be involved in bloody wars orchestrated by NATO. And I mean, all these guys were 3 years ago so proud to say we are finally part of the Western coalition, while Serbs are on the Byzantine eastern side and so on and so on. Now, Serbs did it again. And this is the problem. You won't be able to find a single person ready to go to such a war from Croatia, of course. I'm not discussing professionals who would need something for in terms of payment. And in this respect, NATO is, on one side, really winning. On the other side, there is an old saying from the great Montenegrinian poet Njegoš: both sides are afraid of an empty gun. The one side knows that this gun is empty. The other side sees the gun. And this is, I think, the situation now.
Well, let me say a few words about NATO. I think what we'll likely to see is a return to NATO's core mission. The 1990s unipolar moment in Yugoslavia was a key episode in this development of the alliance. It was a time when NATO got engaged into crisis management and projection, coordination of efforts outside the core area, or outside the perimeter. But the type of issues we are facing now, with annexation, revisionist Russia, Putin reasserting Russian security interests in near abroad, will push NATO allies into consolidation and also will refocus NATO to Article 5 type of mission, territorial defense, kind of the old nitty-gritty world of military planning and defense as the core focus. We are yet to see, though, how it translates into long-term decisions. For one, there's been the persistent problem of allies not spending enough. Are they going to beef up their military budgets at the time where... They did promise, but the hard reality is also that we are not out of the economic crisis. It's not in a acute form anymore. But you have to make a difficult choice between bread and butter. And in these days and age, it's always butter that wins for obvious reasons. So that's one. Secondly, there's a big question mark, and there are other people here to comment on this issue. The nature of the relationship with the US. After Bush, the long-term vision in Washington was pivoting to Asia, withdrawing commitments from Europe, but also from the Middle East primarily. Now, Ukrainian crisis has kind of pushed back US into Europe, the same way as ISIS has actually drawn back the US into the Middle East. But let's see how firm the commitment is, given the long-term sociological trends in the US. That I mean, the familiar story that it's not an Atlantic power anymore. People like Obama were raised in Indonesia, the country we mentioned. They were not raised in Germany. So is the US ready to recommit? What is the level of interest? What is the level of commitment? Is it a game changer? It might be, by the looks of it, bringing us back to familiar territory that we used to know from the old days in the Cold War. But it's too early to say that, because the whole kind of strategic horizon of the US policy is obviously elsewhere, not in Europe.
As a journalist based in Brussels, I have noticed that once the crisis started unfolding in Ukraine, the rhetorics of the then NATO Secretary General Rasmussen was about 2 steps ahead of the rhetorics of the EU diplomats and bureaucrats, and even from the national states. He was actually, I think, the first to use the word aggression and to define Russia as an adversary of NATO. He essentially said, turned it around. He said Russia see NATO as an adversary, but this goes obviously both ways. Now, Mr. Frattini, you were actually shortlisted. That was at least the rumor in the corridors of Brussels for a successor to Rasmussen. Last year there was a lot of talk. You obviously NATO now has another Secretary General. What would you do? What would you have done if you were Secretary General of NATO right now?
Well, absolutely impossible to speculate on that. But since I'm very free to say what I think about that, I think what has been said on the American commitment is something to be taken into consideration. I strongly agree with what has been said on the America leaving Mediterranean. I saw with my eyes at the very beginning of the Libyan crisis, where was Italy even threatening not to offer the Italian air bases to impose NATO commitment instead of the coalition of willing between UK and France on leading the action on Libya. We succeeded with the involvement of, at that time, Secretary Hillary Clinton. I used to be in very close touch with Hillary Clinton, but after the NATO action, we realized that America had decided to withdraw in the very moment where the stabilization of Libya was necessary. I was, in that moment, I left the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the end of 2011, but before leaving, I made a speech at one of the ministerial NATO council saying, knowing Libya much better than many of you, dear colleagues, there is a real risk of partition of Libya in three, and the risk is proving true now. Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and the Berber Tuareg region of Libya are divided. This is first. Egypt, after embracing Mr. Morsi, America decided to leave to its destiny, and now who has been replacing the American advisors to the president of Egypt, Mr. Sisi? Russia, sending 100 military advisors to Cairo. And these are there not only in the port of Tartus in Syria, but also in Suez area. So is that in the interest of NATO? Is that in the interest of Europe? This is not. The problem is that while America decided to, I would say, rethink about its strategy on Mediterranean, Europe was unable to replace that kind of role on our Mediterranean region, which should have been our priority number one. And this has been not, because of cutting spending on defense. Everybody is making a promise in the NATO summit of bringing up to 2%. My country response was in the parliament to cutting by half the strategic problem of F-35 warplanes. This is the first response to the summit of NATO. So in that situation, frankly speaking, the problem is leadership. I understand perfectly that in the United States, the Congress is very reluctant vis-à-vis the initiatives of the President of the United States. But when NATO is in such situation, NATO can do very little. NATO can play, and this is what I have seen yesterday in the first statement of Mr. Stoltenberg, could and should play an even more political role, not threatening to increase military maneuvers at the borders. Let's play a political role. Let's restore mutual trust. And then let's talk about the real enemy, which is not Russia, it's ISIS in Iraq, which is a terrorism, and Qaeda. These are the real enemies of all of us. This is the political problem.
He did mention Stoltenberg in his inauguration speech yesterday. The Ukrainian crisis is the most serious challenge that NATO is facing. He put it even above the ISIS and the Middle East. So he is taking it very, very, very seriously, obviously. We'll see, of course, lots of depends what the United States, and this is also questions to Valbona now. Now you spoke about levels of corruption in Ukraine, and Bechev spoke about Poroshenko as the king of crooks. But that king of crooks received a hero's welcome in Washington. Recently, he managed to do something that Obama could not do for almost 2 years, unite both houses of Congress to vote for a single issue. He was treated absolutely as an ally. And what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, this was also my perspective at the very beginning of my talk, that, we don't really know when the rules-based order, the West-based order was challenged. And, it is also on the relations among Western European countries with countries that have weak governance and oligarchies and rampant corruptions, and also United States at the same time. But before delivering more into this, I'd like to turn also a little bit to Dimitar's question regarding the role of US in Europe. We saw at the very first day of the conference, when the transatlantic trends were mentioned, we understood that both European Union is asking for more leadership on US side, and the US side is asking for more leadership from European Union in the world order. So yeah, we have to see how it goes. I think there is a very, this situation, this crisis, usually from crisis some good things can come out. And I think this is a great momentum for a speedy negotiation and signature of the TTIP agreement, of the of the transatlantic trade and investment agreement between US and European Union. We should not forget that the two continents, the US and European Union, make up the 50% of the world total GDP, have more than 40% of the consumption purchasing power, with only 11% or 12% of the population. And I think this will be good for both European Union and United States, and it is a very timely geopolitical alignment too at the same time. And it is important that this agreement will allow both US and EU to remain the strongest players and able also to set the 21st century standards for global and open competition. Because we all know, until the Ukrainian crisis, the main security crisis also in the European Union was the economic crisis. Economic crisis, Eurozone crisis, accompanied by unemployment and then internal conflicts, internal problems within European Union countries.
Professor Puhovski, would you like to?
Well, three things. First of all, Western values were challenged in the moment when Obama failed to close Guantanamo. Then it was clear that this is a permanent aspect of something called the Western values, something that Putin wouldn't even imagine to do. And this is what has to be said in all clearness. Second, there is only one real ally Putin can have in the world. This is something called caliphate or whatever. If they start killing a bit more Americans, everyone is going to forget Ukraine. Because this is the substance of international media order. And knowing, everyone who knows anything about KGB, and Putin is definitely there, they'll send 2 or 3 Russians to be killed at the same time from the caliphate to show that they are not really so connected with them as someone might think. And then we have a normal, so-called normal picture. Then we'll see, we have a common enemy and should forget these minor things like Ukraine and so on and so on. And this is what I expect to happen within next months, especially since NATO usually intervenes without being prepared. I always recall, the date was, I recall it because it's my birthday, December 15th, 1995, Commander-in-Chief of NATO troops in Europe said in the conference for journalists, I'm proud to announce that NATO troops are going to start entering Bosnia and Herzegovina in 10 days as a consequence of Dayton Accord. This is, without saying, the best Christmas present for the whole population of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But only some 15% of Bosnian population have Christmas on December 25th. 30% have Christmas 13 days later, and 40% are poor guys who have never Christmas. But the NATO general said this is Europe, they are white people, all the white people have Christmas on December 25th, which is a normal, decent thing to do. And this shows how prepared they were while intervening in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The same happened in Iraq, the same happened in Libya, the same happening in Afghanistan. And this is not only about the military. This is about intelligence, by the way, in both meanings of the word.
Well, we had, concerning the Syrian crisis, a recent statement from the White House saying Saudi Arabia has a long border with Syria. Yeah, mistakes happen. I would like, my final question to the panelists here before we open the floor for the audience is, Tim has been covering the wars in former Yugoslavia extensively. Mr. Frattini was engaged as a diplomat. So are there any lessons? Have we learned anything from the Balkan wars that can be applied to the Ukrainian country? So this is the question for all of you, starting with Tim.
Well, I think we do need to react. I don't agree with it's kind of like everything we need to kind of like avoid confrontation at all costs. I think that's just totally wrong. Sorry, I think it's just it's you know, if you take that, if that is not going to lead to peace. That's going to lead to war in Kazakhstan. Well, you know, when then the Russians decide, fine, that was so easy. Now let's go and just chop off half of Kazakhstan. They've got 2 million Russians in the north of Kazakhstan. Well, let's just do that. And then, you know, this is about recreating a Russian empire. It's not about creating a Soviet empire. I don't think they will recreate that. I think Putin has now decided he wants to create a Russian empire. And he's looking at the world through a kind of ideology that people used in the Balkans in the 1990s. Often, some of the ideologists, a kind of 19th century ideology in which certain nations didn't exist. You can talk to people who will tell you, they go, oh, but you know, Ukrainians are not a real nation. They're like an artificial nation. And they're an artificial nation, not like Russians or French. Just like people said Bosniaks didn't exist or Macedonians didn't exist. And you operate, they're not looking through the world at the same glasses as you are. I'm sorry, they're not doing that. They're doing something else. And I think you have to, that's why I think it's quite alarming. It's like peace at all costs. Yeah, but that's not what they're thinking. That's not what they're thinking. And they'll push, and if they can, and if there's no resistance, then they will go on. That's why there's a debate in Moscow now. Let's go all the way to the borders of Romania. That's what people are talking about. Sorry, it's like they're not on the same level. If you don't, and then it'll be like, well, what's going to happen in Estonia? We've got 40% of the population is Russian, and you kind of like concentrate all your kind of media and saying, oh, these poor Russians are kind of oppressed, and it's all just, that's what's going to happen, and then it's going to happen in Kazakhstan, and then it's going to happen elsewhere. They're not talking on the same level as you are.
Mr. Frattini.
Well,
still peace at all costs, or?
Well, I've been heavily involved in Balkans as foreign minister as well as vice president of European Commission in charge of security and justice. So two very important topics for this region. I would say Western Balkans represents a success story for Europe because the European magnet worked. Also because we have been able to cooperate with Russia on the future of Western Balkans. We have been able to have, I would say, not as an alternative perspective, member of Western Balkans becoming Europeans against Russian Federation. I listened yesterday the speech of Prime Minister Vučić. I strongly agree with him. There shouldn't be contradiction between the negotiation of Serbia to become one day a member state of Union and the historical ties with the Russian Federation that Serbia wants to keep. This is the right way.
So do you believe that Ukraine should get the European perspective, as they say?
Well, but first of all, rule of law, fighting corruption, dismantling all these princes of corruption should be one of the preconditions, not making an open promise, you will be for sure. What we have done in Western Balkans, we kept many countries in Western Balkans waiting and waiting and waiting until some results were on the table. It's not possible to have a double standard considering a country like Ukraine, but we forgot Georgia because now we are not talking about Georgia, but you will all remember at the beginning of Eastern Partnership, like all these countries were their destiny to become a pre-accession phase to the European Union. Absolutely wrong. So this is the lesson to be learned. And my final word is on what Valbona, Professor Zeneli just said on TTIP, the treaty with the United States. As you know, during yesterday's and the day before yesterday's hearings before the European Parliament, one of the topics that has been raised in the Parliament with Commissioner Malmström, who will be the Commissioner for Foreign Trade, is that Europe considers some of the chapters of the TTIP counterproductive for the European interest, particularly the chapters on the protection of foreign investments that would be a bigger and greater advantage for Americans rather than European companies, and privacy and data protection chapter. So while we followed American encouragement to impose sanctions on Russia that damage European interest, frankly speaking, we should not double this damage by accepting everything the negotiator from US proposed. So I'm strongly in agreement with President Juncker, who said there are some chapters that are still not acceptable for the European interest. Let's recall sometimes what is our European interest, not only our American friends' interest. Something is different.
Well, actually, I will very slightly disagree here because estimations regarding the TTIP say that the profits for European Union will be larger in terms of money. It will be annually $150 billion more for European Union and $120 billion for United States. This is always, part of the negotiation table. So I fully agree that everything has to be negotiated to come to really good terms for each party.
But you know how tough.
It is
the
tough.
questions yesterday in the Parliament.
It is tough.
And the reply of President Juncker, it was very clear on that.
But we also have to keep in mind that there is also interest of particular countries in European Union that have more or less interest in certain chapters of the TTIP. But I would like to also agree with Tim. I think we have too many frozen conflicts in the region next door to Europe. We have Nagorno-Karabakh, which we saw that the escalation has been much larger since 1993 nowadays. We have a frozen conflict in Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. We have Transnistria in Moldova. So my thinking, I tend to be a positive, an optimist person. My thinking is that Ukraine also will be the same. Russia will be interested into a stalemate situation, into a frozen conflict also in Ukraine. We brought the perspective or the comparisons with the Western Balkans. I think what happened in Ukraine was was seen in the Western Balkans both as an opportunity, a threat, but also a reality check. At the very beginning, when everything happened, many countries in the Western Balkans, they thought that next day will become candidate countries or even, members of European Union, because European Union will open door to this country geopolitically. But it didn't happen, and we heard that Commissioner Ken and President Juncker said that there was going to be a 5 years freeze for entering European Union. There are two different sides of the coin here. This is negative on one point because it stops reforming somehow in these countries, but there could be also a positive side on that. Could be a real reality check for the leaders of these countries to see where they are standing and even take some lessons from Ukraine. What happened last year in Bosnia was very similar to how the protests started in Ukraine. You know, people protesting against inequality, against poverty and unemployment. Mm-hmm. If you ask people in the Western Balkans nowadays, we know that the situation is stable, and this is also the European Union driver in stabilizing this situation. But if you ask them, there are three main challenges for them nowadays. The first one is poverty. Levels of poverty are alarming in the region. There are some countries where more than 50% of the population lives with less than $5 a day. It's unemployment, especially youth unemployment. People in some countries, 70% of the young generation is unemployed. This is really could be a bad driver for social instability in these countries. And the third one is corruption. And corruption could be seen as the cause and consequence of the two previous ones. So I think leaders in the countries should really, I agree with you, should take lessons, should learn the lessons and put them in practice, not just listen to them, what happened, and really reform their economies and strengthen the rule of law in the country. This is really a very strong signal for these countries.
Žarko.
As a great German philosopher Hegel once said, the only thing you can learn from history is that you can't learn anything from history. Because they all make the same stupid things again and again. And this is unfortunately to be seen now in Ukraine, and therefore Team Israel. What we really need are criteria. They usually say same criteria. Criteria always the same, or there are no criteria. If we discuss corruption as an element of entering European Union for these countries outside of the Union, we have to know that all the corrupted people all around post-communist Europe are small pupils compared to some Berlusconi, for instance. Or that the very important aspects of corruption have been imported to these countries from Finland. And these experts from so-called Transparency International claim every year in the last 10 years that Finland is one of the 5 best countries in the world in terms of corruption, because they export their corruption to the Baltic states, to the Czech Republic, to Slovenia, and to Croatia, not to mention some other countries. So we have to take both sides into the equation. Otherwise, we won't understand what's going on. We have to see what it meant for Croatia after the war, or for Serbia after the war, to have something called European perspective, in which for Serbia someone comes and say, look, you can't enter European Union if you do not recognize Kosovo, although 5 members of European Union haven't done that. What is the message out of this? The only one question is whether the leadership of Serbia has the format to use this position to place some kind of new non-alignment position between the two blocs, at least for the period of time. Because, to say very bluntly, for the next 10 years, no country from this area is going to enter European Union. It's absolutely clear for everyone who understands what's going on. So there is quite a period of time to prepare politics. And then the last point. The question of this new Cold War is really doubtful when you start from a very simple fact. No one in his or her right mind would in 1960 claim that living in Italy or Germany in that time was worse than in Nazi or fascist time. It was clear that it was better. But you ask people in Tripoli today or in Baghdad whether it was better during Saddam Hussein's or Gaddafi's days or today, and the answers are going to be, if you're very lucky, 50-50. There is no legitimation for what was done now, while there was legitimation for things in 1945. In finishing the war against Nazis and fascists. And this is the problem. The same goes, by the way, for many of the post-communist countries. Asking now what it meant to live in Yugoslavia in the good old days. And then the last question of Kazakhstan, there is a very simple question. Could you really say that under Soviet or Russian, occupation, Kazakhstan would live worse than today in terms of human rights or in terms of per capita income? And this is the real question, in my opinion.
Well, there is lessons learned, but I'm afraid it's not replicable, it's not implementable, because at the end of the day in the Western Balkans, peace was achieved through intervention, military intervention. And I don't think there's anybody ready to fight, willing to fight for Ukrainian sovereignty. The same way that in 2008 nobody was there to fight for Georgia. We have to face reality. But if I take the liberty to divert your question a tiny bit, and I'll be very brief. I think it's really interesting to look at Russia's strategy towards our region, and I guess we can discuss it in the Q&A afterwards. Obviously, there is quite a bit of divide and rule. Putin is doing it to the EU. He's gaining strategic foothold, economic gains also in the Western Balkans. But I think there's also something very more fundamental happening in the sense that we have also a clash of narratives. We have the EU narrative that the EU has done great things in the region, consolidated peace, brought prosperity. But Russia is using events on the ground as a negative example. In other words, okay, it looks great from Brussels, but it doesn't look as exciting from Tuzla or Belgrade. Look, the promise of Western integration hasn't delivered, so that's why Russia is an alternative. And I don't think Moscow or the Kremlin has the same strategy of imperial expansion as it has in eastern Ukraine, but there is a symbolic meaning, symbolic significance of the Balkans as a counterexample, the dark side of Europeanization, if you will. So I think we are likely to see much more of that.
It will be interesting to see what Putin will say when he comes to Belgrade very soon. So now I'm afraid we have very little time, so let's start with questions. I hope I'll have to assist both the questions and answers should be very brief. Let's start the lady in the back.
Lisa Kaufmann, University of Tübingen. I just wanted to say that I would have to disagree with the statement that there is no room for ideology in the current Russia, because if you take a look what the Russians are saying, they are trying to oppose this kind of European focus on liberalism that they're bringing to Ukraine, and there is a focus of we are the ones who are fighting against fascism in Ukraine, against Nazism, and there is a kind of new blend of anti-Americanism.
But this is not a question.
But I think that a lot of people who are actually neglecting the fact that there is a new ideology in Russia, and you have to kind of take it into consideration when you make this kind of statements. And there is ideology in this conflict.
Does anybody wants to respond?
Very simple. There is the same ideology as the Christian Democrats would claim in Germany, so there is nothing new.
Okay, so going from left to right, the gentleman in the blue jacket. Yes, you.
My name is Özgür Ünlü Sağcıklı, Ankara Office Director of the German Marshall Fund. I don't have a question, but two very brief remarks. One about whether NATO is still necessary or useful. The fact that no NATO member is threatened by third parties doesn't mean that NATO is not necessary, but it means that it's very useful for those countries. We should think about what would happen if NATO did not exist. I think the countries, the neighbors of Russia who are not members of NATO, understand what it means not to be a member of NATO. Second question is about second comment on NATO expansion. I think it's perfectly legitimate to question the wisdom of NATO expansion, and NATO members should question this, but it doesn't mean that NATO should be, that Russia should be given a veto power about who can be a NATO member and who cannot. I think sovereign nations should have the right to make choices about joining or not joining certain blocs, and let me remind you that NATO members did not force any country to be a member of NATO. Quite the contrary, Ukraine wanted to be a NATO member and was rejected. And quite the contrary, Georgia wanted to be a NATO member, and it was rejected.
And Montenegro.
And similarly, the European Union hasn't enforced membership to any country. Ukraine wants to be a EU member, but it's not accommodated.
Thank you. Yes, go.
In here, I agree with you, and actually we have seen also in some countries such as Sweden and Finland, there is increased public support also for these countries joining NATO. And some other countries, such as Georgia and others, they are strengthening reforms because, you know, they are more eager nowadays to become NATO members.
But just imagine Cuba, Mexico, or Panama entering alliance with Russia. We need same argumentation and same criteria.
Okay, so the gentleman with the beard.
Thank you. Dennis Keefe, the British ambassador to Belgrade. I just want to say briefly, having lived for the last 4 years in Russia, I'm with those who say there is an ideology. The point is to understand it. If I can set a precedent by actually asking a question, a question that has been puzzling me is why and how did the EU suddenly become Russia's enemy? That's what's different. It was always, don't join NATO, that's a red line. The EU, we couldn't care less. Suddenly, a year ago, the EU was a threat to Russia. Seems to me that it was Russia that changed, not the EU, but I'd be interested to know the people's views.
That's a good question. So, yes, please.
Yeah, I've posed myself this question time and again. I think part of the explanation has to do with Putin's vision of a Eurasian Union. In other words, we are consolidating our power by roughly imitating the EU in a way, by economic institutions, economic integration. Then you have two rival projects. But you're absolutely right. In the old days, the vision was, or the main policy line was NATO is threatening because we care about military power. EU is too soft of an institution. There's not much to it, so we can live with it. But I think when Putin came to power for his third term in office, and his big project was the Eurasian Union, which is whatever geopolitical content it has, it's also about the nitty-gritty of economic integration. Then the EU became a big problem, and then it played out in Vilnius, and the free trade agreement became the centerpiece of the conflict.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I think it is a really important question because I've been looking at the situation when President Putin has been re-elected. My impression is that there are other three elements that should be taken into consideration. After the re-election, President Putin felt to be under heavy pressure inside the country, mainly for economic reasons. Economy is not performing so well. And don't forget the Russian accession to WTO. You know better than me that this decision had been seen as affecting mainly Russian companies and Russian economy rather than counterparts. So Putin has been blamed. I was present to some conferences where important Russian companies raising very deep doubts about the accession to WTO. So I wouldn't define as an ideology, but as a reaction by exciting national pride instead of and interest. This was the reason why Putin did so and has done what he has done on Crimea, because he tried to escape from being trapped into internal problems, mainly coming from economic sectors. And so these are the two main reasons. And the other one reason why Europe became enemy, because in parallel, you should acknowledge, Europe has been recently trying to elaborate a bit more on European energy security strategy. For example, by trying to diversify energy supply, getting from Azerbaijan, creating some new pipeline. This is another element that created this, I'd say, miscontent in Russia for mainly economic reasons, not ideological reasons in the old sense.
I will just maybe add here that there has been a point where we have seen the European Union unity towards Ukraine and Russia in escalation, and I think that has been when the Malaysian airplane was brought down. So this is where then countries of European Union started to cooperate and come up with a very a cohesive, let's say, approach towards Russia and Ukraine.
I have to say that viewing this from Brussels, it didn't look like, I mean, yes, there was a shock after the Malaysian plane, but it was very brief unity, and immediately
we have to see now.
They started diverging, and we can see that by their essentially failure to make a decision about the sanctions for the second week. The ambassadors have been debating this issue, and they haven't reached. Anyway.
Sorry, one thing. Again, criteria. Russia was most probably indirectly to be blamed for 250 casualties. Israel was directly responsible for 10 times more. Israel received military help. Russia received sanctions. I can't see the logic. Sorry.
Okay, so gentlemen, yes. I hope it's a question.
Yeah, I've got one very short remark and one very quick question, or rather the advice. My name is Kostelnik. I represent Slovak Embassy. I think that it's important to say a little bit about the Ukraine and the genesis of the word Ukraine. It means u kraju, on the periphery, on the margin, and I believe that these things happen when the country is left too long on the periphery. The question, or rather advice, is I would like to know from you, whoever takes the floor, whether I should be thinking about buying a new fireplace to my home. I may confirm that Slovakia, as of yesterday, receives just 50% of the agreed gas supplies. If you could elaborate a little bit how you see immediate future. We were talking about the past, we were talking about the action and reaction, who's guilty, who's not. Now I would like to hear what's gonna happen in the future, in your opinion. Thank you.
Who wants to talk about energy?
It's another.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So we'll have to hurry up. Yeah. I think Mr. Frattini.
Well,
probably best.
I think my country is one of the most diversified country in terms of supply. We get only 30% from Russia. The rest comes from Algeria, from Libya, from the Gulf, and now from Azerbaijan with the new Trans-Adriatic pipeline. So that said, I'm very clear. I remember I was Vice President of European Commission during the first energy crisis with Ukraine, where Slovakia was obliged to stop production of cars for 3 weeks for the lack of energy. We intervened immediately to try to unblock, and we realized that we have no internal energy interconnections among European member states. Italy intervened immediately to supply energy to Slovenia because it's the only country with whom we have a direct connection to help Slovenia. But what I'm saying, first of all, we have to implement trilateral agreement on energy, Russia, Ukraine, European Commission. Secondly, we have to implement in full Minsk agreement. By my point, in parallel, we have to rethink European sanctions that are affecting now European economy equally, if not more, than Russian economy. I'm very clear, even though Italy has not a lot of problems in the field of energy, we have a lot of problem in the field of agricultural products that are blocked now, but is in the interest of Europe to rethink as a whole that kind of commercial war, not only because winter is coming.
And with that note, I'm sorry, the winter is coming indeed. I'll have to close the session. I want to thank I want to thank the BFP and the guests, of course, and I'm sorry there's another session, so we'll have to talk in the